The Yorkshire moors stretched endlessly beneath a pewter sky, their wild beauty both haunting and magnificent in the dying light of autumn. Duke Sebastian Caldwell rode his black stallion along the ancient Roman road that cut through his vast estate, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats and the bitter wind that whipped across the heather-covered hills. At 31, Sebastian possessed the kind of commanding presence that turned heads in London ballrooms and commanded respect in the House of Lords. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught glints of copper in sunlight and eyes the colour of storm clouds, he carried himself with the natural authority of a man born to rule over thousands of acres and influence the fate of nations. Yet for all his wealth, title and undeniable magnetism, Sebastian remained profoundly, achingly alone. The reason was etched in the lines of grief that marked his aristocratic features and the shadows that lingered in his grey eyes. Lady Eleanor Caldwell had been dead for 2 years, claimed by a fever that had swept through London with merciless efficiency. Their marriage had been brief, barely 3 years, but it had been built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Her death had left Sebastian not merely widowed, but fundamentally changed, transformed from a sociable duke who delighted in entertaining to a recluse who found solace only in the management of his estates and the company of his horses. The Tun whispered, of course, as they always did. A duke of his age and station should remarry, should secure the succession, should not waste his prime years mourning a wife who, however beloved, was beyond the reach of grief. But Sebastian found their well-meaning advice as cold and unwelcome as the Yorkshire wind. How could he explain that Eleanor's death had not merely broken his heart, but had shattered his faith in the very possibility of happiness? As his stallion crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of his domain, Sebastian's brooding thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected sight. There, beside the crumbling stone bridge that spanned the stream marking his estate's eastern boundary, a figure lay motionless on the muddy ground. Even from a distance, he could see it was a woman, her pale dress a stark contrast against the dark earth. Sebastian spurred his horse forward, his heart racing with a mixture of concern and curiosity. As he drew closer, the details became clearer and more alarming. The woman was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with honey-coloured hair that had escaped its pins and lay in tangled waves around her face. Her dress, though of good quality, was torn and muddied, and her feet were bare and bloodied, suggesting she had been walking for considerable distances over rough terrain. Dismounting quickly, Sebastian knelt beside the unconscious figure, his trained eye taking in the signs of exhaustion and exposure. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her skin pale but not the waxy pallor of death. She was alive, but clearly in desperate need of immediate care. "Miss," he said gently, touching her shoulder with careful fingers. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer cornflowers, confused and frightened as they struggled to focus on his face. She tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged, barely audible above the wind. "Water," she managed, her lips cracked and dry. Sebastian immediately reached for the flask he always carried, supporting her head gently as he helped her take small sips. The simple act of kindness seemed to revive her somewhat, and she looked at him with growing awareness. Where am I?" she asked, her voice gaining strength, though it remained thread-thin. "You're on my estate, near the village of Thornfield," Sebastian replied, studying her face with growing concern. "I'm Sebastian Caldwell. You're safe now, but you need medical attention. Can you tell me your name?" Fear flickered across her delicate features, and she struggled to sit up despite her obvious weakness. I cannot stay here. If they find me, who is looking for you?" Sebastian asked, his protective instincts stirring to life for the first time since Eleanor's death. The young woman's eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting pursuers to emerge from the gathering dusk. "My guardian, he'll be searching. I cannot be found." Before she could say more, exhaustion overcame her again, and she collapsed back into Sebastian's arms. The trust implicit in that surrender touched something deep within him, something he had thought dead and buried with his wife. Without hesitation, Sebastian lifted the young woman onto his horse, settling her carefully before him as he mounted. She was disturbingly light, clearly undernourished, and her clothes spoke of someone who had been living rough for several days at least. Whatever had driven her to flee her guardian, it must have been desperate indeed. The ride to Caldwell Manor took 20 minutes, during which the young woman drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words that Sebastian couldn't quite catch. He found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she fit naturally against his chest, The faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair despite her obvious hardships, the complete trust she showed in allowing him to care for her. Caldwell Manor rose from the Yorkshire landscape like something from a fairy tale, its ancient stones mellowed by centuries of wind and weather into a warm honey colour that glowed even in the fading light. Built in the Tudor style with later Georgian additions, it was a house that spoke of old money, older traditions, and the kind of deep-rooted stability that came from centuries of careful stewardship. "Mrs. Patterson!" Sebastian called as he carried the unconscious woman through the great hall, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Send for Dr. Whitmore immediately, and prepare the blue guest chamber." His housekeeper, a capable woman in her 50s who had served the Caldwell family for over 2 decades, appeared with the efficiency that marked all her actions. She took one look at the bedraggled figure in Sebastian's arms and immediately understood the situation. "Poor lamb," she murmured, leading the way up the grand staircase. "She looks half-starved. Where did you find her, Your Grace?" "Collapsed by the old bridge," Sebastian replied, following her into the elegantly appointed guest chamber. "She seems to be fleeing from someone. Her guardian, she mentioned." "I want this kept quiet, Mrs. Patterson. No word to the village or the other servants until we know more about her circumstances." "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Patterson replied, already bustling about preparing the room. "I'll have hot water and clean linens brought up immediately, and perhaps some broth when she wakes. She'll need nourishment more than anything else." Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, whose family had served as physicians to the Caldwell estate for 3 generations. After a thorough examination, he emerged from the guest chamber with a grave but not alarming expression. "She's suffering from exhaustion, exposure, and malnutrition," he reported to Sebastian, who had been pacing the corridor outside like an expectant father. "Nothing that rest and proper care won't remedy, but she's been pushed to her limits. I'd estimate she's been traveling on foot for at least a week, possibly more, with little food or shelter." "Will she recover fully?" Sebastian asked, surprised by the intensity of his own concern for a woman whose name he didn't even know. "With proper care, absolutely. She's young and fundamentally healthy, but she'll need time to regain her strength, and she'll need to feel safe. Whatever she was running from has left her in a state of considerable distress." As Dr. Whitmore departed with instructions for the young woman's care, Sebastian found himself drawn back to the guest chamber. She lay pale and still beneath the fine linen sheets, her honey-colored hair spread across the pillow like spun gold. In sleep, her face had lost the pinched look of fear and exhaustion, revealing delicate features that spoke of good breeding and gentle upbringing. He settled into the chair beside her bed, telling himself he was merely ensuring she was properly attended to. But as the hours passed and he watched the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, Sebastian acknowledged that something deeper was at work. For the first time in 2 years, he felt genuinely needed, genuinely useful for something beyond the endless round of estate management and social obligations that had become his life. When dawn broke over the Yorkshire hills, painting the guest chamber in shades of gold and rose, the young woman's eyes fluttered open. She lay still for a moment, taking in her surroundings with obvious confusion, before her gaze settled on Sebastian's face. "You stayed," she said softly, her voice stronger than it had been the previous evening. "I wanted to ensure you were comfortable," Sebastian replied, suddenly self-conscious about his night-long vigil. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." She struggled to sit up, moving carefully as if testing her body's response. "Though I fear I've imposed upon your kindness most terribly, you must think me quite mad, collapsing on your property like some character from a Gothic novel." Sebastian found himself charmed by her attempt at humor despite her obvious distress. "I think you're a young woman who has been through a considerable ordeal and is in need of help. Nothing more, nothing less. You're very kind, Mr. She paused, clearly trying to remember his introduction from the previous evening. "Sebastian Caldwell, Duke of Caldwell," he supplied gently. "And you are?" Her eyes widened at his title, and she seemed to shrink back into the pillows. "Your Grace, I had no idea. I cannot possibly accept such charity from someone of your station." "My station is precisely what enables me to offer such charity," Sebastian said with a slight smile. "And I would hardly call it charity to help someone in distress. It's simply what any decent person would do." For a long moment she was silent, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Margaret Ellis. I was to be married against my will to a man of my guardian's choosing, a man whose character is such that I could not in good conscience bind myself to him for life. So I fled." Sebastian felt his jaw tighten at her words. Forced marriages were unfortunately common among the ton, particularly when financial considerations were involved, but the thought of this delicate young woman being compelled to wed against her wishes stirred his protective instincts to new heights. "Your guardian," he said carefully. "Who is he, if I may ask?" "My uncle, Sir Reginald Blackwood. My parents died when I was 17, leaving me in his care along with a modest inheritance. He has been eager to see me settled in a way that would benefit his own circumstances rather than my happiness." Sebastian knew of Blackwood by reputation, a man of questionable character who had run through his own fortune at the gaming tables and was known to be deeply in debt to some very unsavory characters. The picture Margaret painted was all too clear. A vulnerable young woman with an inheritance being sold to the highest bidder to satisfy her guardian's creditors. "You were absolutely right to flee," Sebastian said firmly. "No woman should be forced into marriage against her will, regardless of the financial considerations involved." Tears gathered in Margaret's cornflower eyes, and she looked away, as if ashamed of her emotional response. "But what am I to do now? I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I used what little money I had hidden away to travel this far, but it's gone now. If my uncle finds me—" "He won't," Sebastian interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. "You have my protection, Miss Ellis. Whatever you need, sanctuary, legal assistance, a new beginning, I will provide it." Margaret stared at him in wonder, as if unable to believe such kindness could exist in the world. "But why? You don't know me. For all you know, I could be lying, could be some sort of adventuress seeking to take advantage of your generosity." "Are you?" Sebastian asked with a slight smile. "No," Margaret replied immediately, then blushed at her vehement response. "That is, no, Your Grace. I am exactly what I appear to be, a foolish young woman who has made a terrible mess of her life." "Then that's all I need to know," Sebastian said simply. "You're a young woman in distress, and I have the means to help you. That's reason enough for any decent person." Over the following days, as Margaret regained her strength under Mrs. Patterson's devoted care and Dr. Whitmore's watchful eye, Sebastian found himself drawn to the guest chamber with increasing frequency. What began as simple concern for her welfare gradually transformed into something deeper and more complex, as he came to know the remarkable young woman he had rescued. Margaret Ellis, he discovered, was far more than just a pretty face in distress. She possessed a quick intelligence that sparkled in their conversations, a dry wit that could make him laugh despite his habitual reserve, and a strength of character that had enabled her to risk everything rather than submit to an intolerable fate. She was well educated, clearly from a good family, and possessed of accomplishments that marked her as a lady of refinement despite her current circumstances. "You play beautifully," Sebastian observed one afternoon, as Margaret sat at the pianoforte in the music room, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys in a complex piece by Bach. "My mother insisted on a thorough musical education," Margaret replied, her expression growing wistful. "She said that music was one of the few things that could never be taken away from a woman, regardless of her circumstances. I never understood what she meant until now." "Your mother sounds like a very wise woman." "She was. I think she would have been horrified to know what became of me after her death, reduced to fleeing in the night, like some common criminal." Sebastian moved to stand beside the pianoforte, studying Margaret's profile as she continued to play. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows caught the golden highlights in her hair and illuminated the delicate curve of her cheek. "You're not reduced to anything, Miss Ellis. You made a courageous choice to preserve your independence and your honor. That takes remarkable bravery, not desperation." Margaret's hands stilled on the keys as she looked up at him, her cornflower eyes wide with surprise. "You truly believe that? That what I did was brave rather than simply foolish?" "I believe," Sebastian said quietly, "that you are one of the most courageous people I have ever met. To risk everything, your security, your social position, your very safety, rather than compromise your principles. That is the definition of true bravery." A soft blush colored Margaret's cheeks at his words, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with an awareness that neither had expected. Sebastian found himself noticing details he had no business noticing, the way her lips curved when she was pleased, the small dimple that appeared in her left cheek when she smiled, the graceful line of her neck as she turned her head. "You're very kind to say so, Your Grace," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been longing. "Sebastian," he corrected gently. "When we're alone, I would prefer you call me Sebastian." Margaret's blush deepened, That would hardly be proper, Your Grace. The difference in our stations, propriety, Sebastian said with a slight smile, is a luxury we can perhaps dispense with given the unusual circumstances of our acquaintance. Besides, I find I much prefer the sound of my name on your lips to any title. The admission surprised them both with its intimacy, and Margaret looked away, clearly flustered by the turn their conversation had taken. That is, it would not be appropriate. Margaret, Sebastian said quietly, and the sound of her name spoken in his deep voice made her look up at him again. Nothing about our situation is conventional or appropriate. You're a young woman of good family, living under my protection without a proper chaperone, and I'm a widowed duke who finds himself more interested in your welfare than is strictly proper. Perhaps we might allow ourselves some small freedoms in private, given that we're already so far beyond the bounds of conventional propriety. Margaret studied his face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. What she saw there, warmth, sincerity, and something deeper that made her heart race, convinced her to take the risk. Sebastian, she said softly, testing the name on her tongue. It suits you much better than Your Grace. More human, somehow. I haven't felt particularly human in some time, Sebastian admitted, the words escaping before he could stop them. Not since Eleanor died. Margaret's expression grew gentle with understanding. Your wife? Yes, 2 years ago. A fever that swept through London. Sebastian found himself sharing details he had never spoken aloud to anyone, drawn by something in Margaret's manner that invited confidence. We were content together. Our marriage was arranged by our families when we were children, but we grew to care for each other genuinely. Her death left me feeling as though I was merely going through the motions of living rather than truly being alive. I'm so sorry for your loss, Margaret said with genuine sympathy. It must have been a great love to affect you so profoundly. It was a good marriage, Sebastian said carefully, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. But what I'm feeling now... He stopped, realizing he was venturing into dangerous territory. What are you feeling now? Margaret asked quietly, her cornflower eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. Sebastian met her gaze directly, his grey eyes dark with suppressed emotion, something I never expected to feel again. Something that has nothing to do with duty or family expectations, and everything to do with choice, with desire. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Margaret felt her heart begin to race. She had never been spoken to with such frank honesty, had never been looked at with the kind of intensity Sebastian was showing her now. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Your Grace, Sebastian, she began, but her words were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Patterson with the afternoon tea service. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, the housekeeper said, clearly sensing the charged atmosphere in the room. Shall I return later? No, Mrs. Patterson, thank you, Sebastian replied, his voice carefully controlled, though his eyes never left Margaret's face. We were just discussing Miss Ellis's musical accomplishments. As Mrs. Patterson bustled about setting up the tea service, Margaret and Sebastian maintained a careful distance, but the awareness between them remained, simmering just beneath the surface of polite conversation. Something fundamental had shifted in their relationship, and both of them knew there would be no going back to the simple dynamic of rescuer and rescued. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into winter and Margaret's strength returned fully, Sebastian found his carefully ordered world transformed by her presence. She brought life to rooms that had stood empty since Eleanor's death, filled the manor with laughter and music, and challenged him intellectually in ways he hadn't experienced in years. More than that, she seemed to see past his title and wealth to the man beneath, offering him a companionship that was both stimulating and deeply comforting. For her part, Margaret bloomed under Sebastian's protection and kindness. The frightened, desperate young woman who had collapsed beside his estate road gradually gave way to someone confident and radiant, secure in the knowledge that she was valued for herself rather than her inheritance or family connections. She began to take an interest in the running of the estate, asking intelligent questions about agricultural improvements and tenant welfare that impressed Sebastian with their insight. You have a natural understanding of these matters, he observed one morning, as they toured the estate's model dairy, which had been designed according to the latest scientific principles. Most ladies of quality consider such things beneath their notice. Perhaps most ladies of quality have never been forced to consider what happens when the money runs out, Margaret replied with a rueful smile. My uncle's mismanagement of my inheritance taught me that understanding practical matters is essential for survival. Your uncle is a fool, Sebastian said bluntly. To squander not only his own fortune but yours as well, and then to attempt to force you into marriage to cover his debts. It's unconscionable. Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching the dairymaids go about their work with practiced efficiency. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had simply submitted to his wishes, if I had married Mr. Hartwell, as he demanded. Hartwell? Sebastian's voice sharpened. Josiah Hartwell. You know him? Margaret asked, surprised by his reaction. By reputation, unfortunately. He's a man of considerable wealth, but absolutely no character. There have been rumors about his treatment of women, particularly those in vulnerable positions. Sebastian's jaw tightened as he considered what Margaret's fate might have been. You were absolutely right to refuse such a match, regardless of the consequences. The consequences have been rather severe, Margaret pointed out. I'm now completely dependent on your charity, with no prospects and no family to turn to. Perhaps marriage to Mr. Hartwell would have been the lesser of two evils. Sebastian stopped walking and turned to face her, his grey eyes intense with emotion. Margaret, you must never think that. Never. What you've gained by refusing that marriage, your freedom, your self-respect, your ability to choose your own path, is worth more than any security such a union might have provided. Is it? Margaret asked softly. Sometimes I feel as though I'm living in a fairy tale that must inevitably end. You've been incredibly kind, Sebastian, but I cannot remain here indefinitely as an object of charity. What if you weren't here as an object of charity? Sebastian asked quietly, his heart racing as he prepared to voice the thoughts that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Margaret looked at him with confusion. I don't understand what you mean. Sebastian took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them. I mean, what if you were here as my wife? The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Margaret felt the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She stared at him in shock, her mind reeling with the implications of what he had just suggested. Sebastian, you cannot be serious, she whispered. I'm nobody, a penniless refugee with nothing to offer a duke. The scandal alone would be worth it, Sebastian interrupted, stepping closer to her. Margaret, these past weeks have shown me something I thought I'd lost forever, the possibility of genuine happiness. You've brought joy back into my life when I was convinced such a thing was impossible. You've made me remember what it feels like to truly live, rather than merely exist. Tears gathered in Margaret's cornflower eyes as she struggled to process what he was saying. But your first wife, you loved her. I did love Eleanor, Sebastian acknowledged, his voice gentle but firm. But what I feel for you is entirely different. With Eleanor, I loved the girl I had always known I would marry, the woman chosen for me by family and circumstance. With you, I love the woman I choose to love, freely and completely, with full knowledge of what that choice means. The ton will never accept me, Margaret protested, even as her heart soared at his words. A duke marrying a woman with no family, no connections, no dowry. Then they'll have to learn to accept it, Sebastian said firmly, reaching out to take her hands in his. I've spent too many years caring about the opinions of people who matter nothing to me. What matters is what we feel for each other, what we can build together. Margaret felt her last defenses crumble as she looked into his eyes and saw the depth of his sincerity. What do you feel for me, Sebastian? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian lifted his hands to cup her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. I love you, Margaret Ellis. I love your courage, your intelligence, your compassion. I love the way you make me laugh, the way you challenge my assumptions, the way you see beauty and possibility in things I had forgotten to notice. I love you not because you need my protection, but because you make me a better man simply by being yourself. I love you too, Margaret whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. I tried not to, tried to tell myself it was merely gratitude or the natural attachment of someone rescued to their rescuer, but it's so much more than that. You've given me not just safety and security, but hope for a future I never dared imagine. The kiss that followed was tender and passionate, a sealing of promises made and futures intertwined. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, and Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes? He asked with a smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and happier than Margaret had ever seen him. Yes, Margaret laughed, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. Yes, Sebastian Caldwell, I will marry you, though I still think you must be quite mad to want to tie yourself to someone like me. Mad with love, Sebastian agreed, pulling her close again. The very best kind of madness there is, the engagement. The announcement of the Duke of Caldwell's engagement to Miss Margaret Ellis sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated from the grandest drawing rooms of Mayfair to the humblest coffeehouses of the city. Within hours of the news reaching the Tun, every hostess worth her salt was desperately trying to discover more about the mysterious young woman who had somehow captured the heart of one of England's most eligible and elusive widowers. "Nobody knows anything about her," declared Lady Pemberton at her weekly salon, her voice carrying the particular tone of affront reserved for social mysteries that dared to remain unsolved. "No family connections that anyone can identify, no dowry to speak of." And she simply appeared at Caldwell Manor like something out of one of those dreadful Gothic novels that young ladies are always reading. "I heard she was found unconscious on his estate road," whispered Mrs. Ashworth, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Some say she's nothing more than a clever fortune hunter who staged the entire encounter to ensnare him." "Absolute nonsense," interrupted the Dowager Countess of Whitmore, whose opinion carried considerable weight in society due to her advanced age and formidable connections. "I've known Sebastian Caldwell since he was in leading strings, and he's far too intelligent and far too cautious to be taken in by such a transparent scheme. If he's chosen to marry this young woman, she must possess qualities that genuinely recommend her." "But surely you must admit it's all rather irregular," pressed Lady Pemberton. "A duke of his standing marrying someone so completely unknown to society. It's simply not done." "Perhaps," the Dowager Countess replied with a slight smile, "that's precisely why he's doing it. Sebastian has never been one to follow convention simply for the sake of convention. He marries to please himself, not to satisfy the expectations of people whose opinions he values not at all." At Caldwell Manor, Sebastian and Margaret were blissfully unaware of the storm their engagement had created in London society. They were far too occupied with the delicate process of planning their wedding and navigating the complex emotions that came with their newfound commitment to each other. "I should warn you," Sebastian said one morning as they breakfasted together in the sunny morning room that had become their favorite spot for private conversation, "that my mother will undoubtedly want to meet you before the wedding. She's been in Bath for her health these past months, but news of our engagement will bring her home with all possible speed." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of nervousness at the mention of Sebastian's formidable mother. "What if she disapproves of me? What if she thinks you're making a terrible mistake by marrying so far beneath your station?" "Then she'll be wrong," Sebastian said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand in his. "But I don't believe she will disapprove. My mother has always valued character above all else, and you have character in abundance." "Still, I cannot help but worry," Margaret admitted. "I have no experience with duchesses or grand society. What if I embarrass you? What if I prove unequal to the demands of being your wife?" Sebastian brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that made her heart flutter, despite the weeks that had passed since their engagement. "You could never embarrass me, Margaret. You're intelligent, well-educated, and naturally gracious. The rest, the protocol, the social expectations, the endless round of calls and entertainments, those are just performances that can be learned. What matters is who you are beneath all that, and who you are is perfect." Their intimate conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a travel-worn messenger bearing urgent correspondence from London. Sebastian's expression grew serious as he read the letter, and Margaret felt her stomach clench with the familiar fear that had become her constant companion since fleeing her uncle's house. "What is it?" she asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. "A letter from my solicitor," Sebastian replied, his voice carefully controlled, though she could see the anger building in his grey eyes. "It seems Sir Reginald has discovered your whereabouts and is demanding your immediate return. He's threatening legal action if I don't surrender you to his custody within the week." Margaret went pale, her hand trembling as she set down her teacup. "He's found me. I knew this peace couldn't last forever." "Peace," Sebastian said firmly, moving to kneel beside her chair and taking both her hands in his, "is exactly what will last. Your uncle has no legal claim on you, Margaret. You're of age and completely free to make your own choices. My solicitors will make that abundantly clear to him." "But he's my guardian," Margaret began, the old fears rising despite Sebastian's reassurances. "You're 24 years old," Sebastian interrupted gently but firmly. "Guardianship ends at majority, and you've been legally independent for 3 years. He has no more authority over you than any stranger you might encounter on the street." "Then why is he threatening legal action?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Because he's desperate. My inquiries have revealed that his debts are even more extensive than I initially believed. He owes money to some very dangerous people, and he was counting on your marriage to Hartwell to provide the funds necessary to save himself from ruin. So my refusal to marry has essentially signed his death warrant, Margaret said quietly. His own choices signed his death warrant, Sebastian corrected firmly. You are not responsible for his gambling debts or his poor financial decisions. You are only responsible for your own happiness and well-being. Despite Sebastian's reassurances, the shadow cast by her uncle's threats hung over the following days as they continued their wedding preparations. Sebastian had decided on a ceremony at the estate chapel, intimate but elegant, with only close friends and family in attendance. Margaret had initially protested that such a small wedding was beneath his station, but Sebastian insisted that their happiness was more important than social display. Besides, he said as they reviewed the guest list together in his study, I want our wedding to be about us, about our commitment to each other, not about impressing people whose opinions mean nothing to me. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Caldwell 3 days before the wedding created a considerable stir throughout the manor. Sebastian's mother was a formidable woman in her early 60s, still beautiful, despite her silver hair and the lines that marked her aristocratic features. She swept into Caldwell Manor with an entourage of servants and an air of absolute authority that made Margaret's knees tremble despite her best efforts to appear composed. So, the Dowager Duchess said without preamble, studying Margaret with sharp blue eyes that were remarkably like her son's, you're the young woman who has somehow managed to capture my Sebastian's heart. Your Grace, Margaret replied, offering her most graceful curtsy while praying her voice wouldn't betray her nervousness. I'm deeply honored to meet you. The older woman said, circling Margaret as if she were evaluating a horse for purchase. Pretty enough, I suppose, though you're rather thin. Have you been eating properly? Sebastian, has this girl been eating properly? Margaret has been recovering from a difficult period in her life, Sebastian replied diplomatically, moving to stand protectively beside his fiancée. She's much stronger now than when she first arrived. Good posture, excellent deportment. The Dowager Duchess continued her assessment. Tell me, child, what are your accomplishments? Can you sing, play, speak languages? Manage a household? Margaret felt as though she were being examined for flaws, but she answered with as much composure as she could muster. I speak French and Italian tolerably well, Your Grace. I play the pianoforte and sing, though I make no claims to exceptional talent. I'm well read in literature and history, and I believe I'm capable of managing a household efficiently. And your family? Your connections? Both my parents are deceased, Your Grace. I have no other family save my uncle, from whom I am permanently estranged. The Dowager Duchess raised an eyebrow at this diplomatic phrasing, but didn't press for details. Instead, she turned to Sebastian, who had been watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement. She'll do, she announced, as if Margaret weren't standing right there. She has spirit, I can see it in her eyes, and she's not intimidated by me, which shows proper backbone. More importantly, you look happier than you have since Eleanor died. That's worth more than all the noble bloodlines in England. Sebastian smiled, moving to take Margaret's hand in a gesture of support and solidarity. I am happier, Mother. Happier than I ever thought I could be again. The Dowager Duchess's expression softened slightly as she observed the obvious affection between her son and his chosen bride. Good. Eleanor was a dear girl, and I loved her like a daughter, but she's gone. The living must live, and it's time you remembered that. This one, she gestured toward Margaret with something approaching approval, will give you strong children and keep you from becoming a complete hermit. Margaret felt her cheeks burn at the frank assessment, but she was grateful for what seemed to be acceptance, however grudgingly given. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect December weather that seemed designed specifically for new beginnings. Margaret woke early in her chamber, surrounded by the bustle of preparation, as Mrs. Patterson and several maids helped her dress in the gown Sebastian had commissioned from London's finest modiste. The dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, cut in the latest fashion, but with a timeless elegance that ensured it would never look dated. The Caldwell family pearls, a wedding gift from the Dowager Duchess, gleamed at Margaret's throat, and her honey-colored hair was arranged in an elaborate style that showcased the delicate diamond tiara that had belonged to Sebastian's grandmother. You look like a princess from a fairy tale, breathed young Sarah, one of the housemaids, as she helped arrange Margaret's train with reverent care. Margaret studied her reflection in the cheval glass, hardly recognizing the elegant woman who looked back at her. Just months ago, she had been a desperate fugitive, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of coins. Now she was about to become a duchess, mistress of one of England's great estates and wife to a man who loved her for herself alone. The chapel at Caldwell Manor was small but exquisite, its ancient stones warmed by the light of hundreds of candles and decorated with hothouse flowers that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. As Margaret walked down the aisle, on the arm of Sebastian's closest friend, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of family, she saw only Sebastian waiting for her at the altar. He looked magnificent in his formal dress, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, and his grey eyes fixed on her face with an expression of such love and devotion that it took her breath away. When she reached his side and he took her hand, Margaret felt a sense of rightness, of coming home that she had never experienced before. The ceremony itself was conducted by the elderly rector, who had served the parish for nearly 4 decades. His voice, weathered by age but still strong, carried easily through the small chapel as he spoke eloquently about the nature of love and commitment, about the courage required to join 2 lives into one, and about the blessing that came to those who chose hope over fear. When it came time for the vows, both Sebastian and Margaret spoke with voices that carried clearly through the chapel, their words ringing with sincerity and conviction that moved several of the guests to tears. "I, Sebastian, take thee, Margaret, to be my wedded wife," Sebastian said, his voice steady and sure, "to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Margaret's response was equally heartfelt, her voice clear and strong, despite the tears that sparkled in her cornflower eyes. "I, Margaret, take thee, Sebastian, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey, till death do us part." When they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Sebastian had commissioned from the finest goldsmith in London, Margaret felt as though she were participating in a miracle. The ring that Sebastian slipped onto her finger had been blessed by the rector, and represented not just their commitment to each other, but her transformation from a woman with no prospects to the Duchess of Caldwell. "You may kiss your bride," the rector announced with a smile, and Sebastian needed no further encouragement. The kiss was gentle but sure, a promise of all the tenderness and passion that lay ahead. When they broke apart, both were smiling through their tears, and the small congregation erupted in applause and good wishes that echoed off the ancient stone walls. As they walked back down the aisle together, now husband and wife, Margaret caught sight of the faces around them, tenants and neighbours, servants and friends, all beaming with genuine happiness for their duke's newfound joy. Even the Dowager Duchess was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though she maintained her dignified composure. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the great hall, which had been transformed for the occasion, with garlands of evergreen and winter roses. The meal was sumptuous, but not ostentatious, featuring the finest produce from the estate and wines from Sebastian's carefully curated cellars. "To the Duke and Duchess of Caldwell," declared Lord Ashworth, Sebastian's oldest friend, rising from his seat with a glass of champagne. "May their love story inspire us all to believe in the possibility of second chances and the triumph of true affection over mere convenience." The toast was echoed enthusiastically by all present, and Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly accepted, truly valued for who she was, rather than what she could provide. As the afternoon wore on and the guests gradually departed, Margaret found herself alone with Sebastian in the drawing room, still wearing her wedding gown and feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. "How do you feel, Your Grace?" Sebastian asked with a smile, using her new title for the first time. "Overwhelmed," Margaret admitted with a laugh that was part joy, part disbelief. "This morning I was Miss Ellis, a woman with no family and uncertain prospects. Now I'm the Duchess of Caldwell, mistress of this magnificent estate and wife to the most wonderful man in England." "And how does it feel to be my wife?" Sebastian asked, moving closer to her. Margaret reached up to touch his face gently, marveling at her right to do so freely now. "Like coming home," she said softly, "like finding the place where I was always meant to be, even when I didn't know such a place existed." Sebastian gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the last light of their wedding day faded into the gentle darkness of evening. "I love you, Margaret Caldwell," he murmured against her hair. "My Duchess, my wife, my heart." "And I love you," Margaret replied, her voice full of wonder at the miracle of their love. "My husband, my protector, my future." As they stood together in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the beauty and security of their home, both Sebastian and Margaret knew that they had found something precious beyond measure, a love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances into something that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The lost young woman and the grieving Duke had found in each other not just salvation, but a love story that would be remembered and treasured for generations to come. 2 years later, the gardens of Caldwell Manor bloomed with the full glory of an English summer, their carefully tended beds a riot of colour and fragrance that drew admiring visitors from across 3 counties. Margaret walked slowly along the gravel paths, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly, where their second child grew, the other guiding their 18-month-old son, James, as he toddled unsteadily among the flower beds with the determined concentration that marked all his explorations. It had been 2 years of profound transformation, not just for Margaret and Sebastian personally, but for the entire estate and everyone connected to it. Under Margaret's gentle but efficient guidance, Caldwell Manor had become renowned throughout Yorkshire for its hospitality, its progressive agricultural methods, and the genuine warmth with which visitors were received. The Duchess of Caldwell, as society had learned to its surprise and delight, possessed not only beauty and grace but a practical intelligence and genuine compassion that endeared her to everyone from the highest nobleman to the humblest tenant farmer. "There you are," Sebastian's voice came from behind her, warm with the affection and gentle concern that had become his natural tone whenever he addressed his wife. "You shouldn't be walking alone in your condition, especially while chasing after our young explorer." Margaret turned to smile at her husband, noting how the past 2 years had transformed him from the grief-stricken recluse she had first encountered into a man who radiated contentment and purpose. "I'm perfectly well, Sebastian, and Dr. Whitmore says exercise is beneficial for both the baby and me. Besides, James needs the fresh air and activity." "James needs a nursemaid to keep him from eating the roses," Sebastian replied with a laugh, swooping down to catch their son just as the boy reached for a particularly tempting bloom. "Come here, you little rascal. Let's leave Mamma's flowers alone, shall we?" The child gurgled with delight at his father's attention, his grey eyes so like Sebastian's, sparkling with mischief as he reached for his father's watch chain with the single-minded determination that characterized all his endeavors. "I had a letter from London today," Sebastian mentioned, as they settled on a bench beneath an ancient oak tree that provided welcome shade from the afternoon sun. "From the trustees of the foundation. They've approved funding for 3 new refugees, including one in Edinburgh, that will specifically serve young women fleeing forced marriages." Margaret's face lit up with the particular joy that always accompanied news of their charitable work. "Truly, we'll be able to help even more women in situations like mine was." "Indeed we will." The Margaret Caldwell Foundation for the Protection of Vulnerable Women has now assisted over 200 young women in finding safety, legal protection, and new opportunities for independence. Your idea has grown beyond anything we initially imagined. It had been Margaret's inspiration to transform her own painful experience into a force for good in the world. Too many young women, she had argued, found themselves at the mercy of unscrupulous guardians or family members who valued financial gain over their ward's welfare and happiness. The foundation provided them with alternatives, safe houses, legal assistance, educational opportunities, and most importantly, the knowledge that they had choices beyond submission or destitution. "I can hardly believe how much has changed," Margaret said softly, watching as Sebastian entertained their son with a game of peekaboo that sent the child into fits of delighted laughter. 2 years ago, I was a desperate fugitive with no hope for the future. Now I'm surrounded by more love and purpose than I ever dared dream possible. You've transformed not just your own life, but countless others," Sebastian said, his voice rich with admiration and love. "The foundation, the improvements to the estate, the way you've brought warmth and life back to this house, you've created something beautiful from what began as tragedy." "We've created it together," Margaret corrected gently. "I could never have accomplished any of this without your support, your resources, and your unwavering belief in the importance of the work." Their peaceful conversation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Patterson, who came bearing a silver salver with the afternoon post. Her expression carried the particular combination of excitement and concern that suggested news of unusual import. "Oh, your graces," she said with a curtsy. "Forgive the interruption, but there's a letter that I believe requires your immediate attention. It bears the seal of Sir Reginald Blackwood." Margaret felt the familiar flutter of anxiety at her uncle's name, though it was much diminished from the paralyzing fear she had once experienced. Sebastian's arm tightened protectively around her shoulders as he accepted the letter and broke the seal. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read, and Margaret found herself holding her breath despite her determination not to let her uncle's machinations disturb her hard-won peace. "What does he want now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Money, as always," Sebastian replied, his voice cold with contempt. "But this time he's taken a different approach. He's not threatening legal action or demanding your return. Instead, he's apologizing." "Apologizing?" Margaret repeated in surprise. "That seems rather out of character." "Indeed it does. He claims to have seen the error of his ways, expresses deep regret for his treatment of you, and begs for the opportunity to make amends. He's heard about the foundation and wishes to contribute to its work as a way of atoning for his past behavior." Margaret studied her husband's face, reading the skepticism there that matched her own. "You don't believe him?" "Not for a moment. My investigators inform me that his creditors have finally lost patience with his excuses and delays. He's facing debtor's prison within the month unless he can raise a substantial sum immediately. So this sudden attack of conscience is merely another attempt to extract money from us," Margaret said with a sigh. "How much does he want?" £5,000, ostensibly as a donation to the foundation, but with the understanding that you might feel moved to assist a repentant relative in his time of need. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching as their son played contentedly in the grass at their feet, blissfully unaware of the adult complexities being discussed above his head. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and certain. "No," she said simply. Sebastian looked at her with surprise and admiration. "No? No. I will not reward his past cruelty and present deception with financial assistance. He made his choices, Sebastian, just as I made mine. The difference is that I was willing to sacrifice everything for my principles, while he has consistently sacrificed his principles for temporary gain. The foundation could use the money," Sebastian pointed out, though his tone suggested he agreed with her decision. "The foundation will receive its funding from people who genuinely support its mission, not from those who see it as a convenient excuse for extortion. My uncle forfeited any claim to my consideration when he attempted to sell me to pay his gambling debts. I will not enable his continued self-destruction by rewarding his manipulation with charity." Sebastian pressed a kiss to her temple, his pride in her strength and wisdom evident in his touch. "I love you, Margaret Caldwell. Your compassion for those who deserve it is matched only by your refusal to be taken advantage of by those who don't." "I learned from an excellent teacher," Margaret replied with a smile, leaning into his warmth. "You showed me that kindness and strength aren't mutually exclusive, that one can be generous without being foolish." As if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, young James abandoned his exploration of the grass and toddled over to his parents, raising his arms in the universal gesture of a child who wanted to be held. Margaret gathered him onto her lap, marveling as she always did at the miracle of this small life they had created together. "What shall we tell him about his uncle when he's old enough to ask?" she wondered aloud. "The truth," Sebastian said firmly, "that some people make choices that lead to happiness and fulfillment, while others make choices that lead to misery and regret. We'll teach him to choose wisely and to accept responsibility for the consequences of his decisions. And we'll teach him that family is defined by love and loyalty, not merely by blood," Margaret added, thinking of the warm relationships they had built with Sebastian's mother, their friends, and the extended family of servants and tenants who had embraced her so completely. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the small family made their way back toward the manor house. Margaret walked slowly, her hand in Sebastian's, while he carried their drowsy son, who had exhausted himself with his adventures in the garden. "Do you ever regret it?" Sebastian asked suddenly, the question that had become something of a ritual between them. Responding to that advertisement, taking such an enormous risk with a complete stranger? Margaret paused to consider the question seriously, as she always did, though her answer never varied. "Never," she said with absolute conviction. "It was the best decision I ever made, even though I had no way of knowing it at the time. It brought me you, brought me our children. brought me a life of purpose and meaning that I never could have imagined. Even knowing what you know now about the challenges we've faced, the social difficulties, the gossip, the ongoing complications with your uncle, especially knowing all of that, Margaret replied firmly. Real love isn't about avoiding difficulties, Sebastian. It's about facing them together, supporting each other through challenges, growing stronger rather than weaker in the face of adversity. We've done that, and we'll continue to do it for the rest of our lives. As they entered the manor house, young James stirred in his father's arms, opening his grey eyes to gaze up at his parents with the trusting innocence of a child who had never known anything but love and security. In his small face, Margaret could see not just the future of their family, but the future of all the children who would benefit from the foundation they had built together. Children who would grow up knowing that they had choices, that they were valued for themselves, that love and protection were their birthright rather than privileges to be earned. Papa, James murmured sleepily, his small hand reaching up to touch Sebastian's face with the casual affection that marked all his interactions with his parents. Yes, little man, Sebastian replied softly, his voice full of the wonder that still occasionally overcame him when he contemplated the completeness of his current happiness. Time for your nap, I think. As they made their way up the grand staircase toward the nursery, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had taken place within these walls. The house that had once echoed with loneliness and grief now rang with laughter and purpose. Every room held memories of joy. The music room where she and Sebastian had first acknowledged their growing feelings, the library where he had proposed, the drawing room where they had planned their wedding, and now the nursery where their children would grow up surrounded by love and security. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that we have visitors arriving tomorrow, Sebastian said, as they settled James in his cot, the child already drifting towards sleep despite his protests that he wasn't tired. The delegation from the Edinburgh Refuge? Margaret asked, smoothing their son's dark hair with gentle fingers. Among others. Lady Whitmore is bringing her niece, who has expressed interest in supporting the Foundation's work, and Dr. Morrison from the London Hospital wants to discuss establishing a medical clinic specifically for women who have suffered abuse or neglect. Margaret felt the familiar surge of excitement that accompanied news of the Foundation's expanding reach. How wonderful! The more people we can involve in this work, the more women we can help to find safety and independence. You realize, don't you, that you've become something of a celebrity in certain circles, Sebastian observed with amusement as they made their way to their own chambers. The mysterious woman who captured a duke's heart and then used her position to champion the cause of vulnerable women. The newspapers are calling you the Angel Duchess of Yorkshire. Margaret laughed, shaking her head at the dramatic title. Hardly an angel, simply someone who remembers what it feels like to be desperate and alone, and who has been blessed with the resources to help others avoid that fate. That's exactly what makes you an angel, Sebastian said seriously, drawing her into his arms as they entered their private sitting room. Your ability to transform your own pain into compassion for others, to use your experience as a foundation for helping rather than a reason for bitterness. I had an excellent example, Margaret replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with tender fingers. You could have simply provided me with temporary shelter and then sent me on my way with a small settlement. Instead, you saw something in me worth nurturing, worth protecting, worth loving. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness, that generosity doesn't require naivety. The kiss that followed was tender and passionate, a reaffirmation of the love that had grown stronger with each passing day of their marriage. When they broke apart, both were breathless, and Sebastian rested his forehead against hers in the gesture that had become their private signal of complete understanding and acceptance. I have something for you, Sebastian said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small velvet box, an early anniversary gift, though I couldn't wait until the actual date to give it to you. Margaret accepted the box with curiosity and delight, gasping when she opened it to reveal a delicate pendant in the shape of a phoenix, crafted from gold and set with tiny diamonds that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in brilliant sparkles. Sebastian, it's beautiful, she breathed, lifting the pendant to examine the exquisite workmanship. But what does it signify? You, he said simply. Rising from the ashes of your old life to become something magnificent and powerful, the phoenix represents rebirth, transformation, the triumph of hope over despair. It seemed appropriate. Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes as she understood the deeper meaning behind his gift. Will you put it on for me? As Sebastian fastened the delicate chain around her neck, Margaret caught sight of their reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate fugitive who had collapsed beside Sebastian's estate road 2 years ago. This woman was confident, loved and secure in her place in the world. She wore her happiness like a crown, and her purpose like armor. "Do you think she would be proud of me?" Margaret asked suddenly. "My mother, I mean. Do you think she would approve of the choices I've made, the life I've built?" Sebastian's arms tightened around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head as he considered her question. "I think she would be amazed by your courage, humbled by your compassion, and overwhelmed with pride at the woman you've become. You've taken the values she instilled in you and used them to create something beautiful and meaningful." "I hope so," Margaret said softly. "I hope she would understand why I had to run, why I couldn't submit to my uncle's demands even when it seemed like the safer choice." "She would understand," Sebastian assured her, "because she raised a daughter who valued her integrity more than her security, who was willing to risk everything rather than compromise her principles. That kind of strength doesn't develop overnight. It's cultivated over years of careful guidance and example." Their intimate conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, followed by the entrance of Mrs. Patterson, bearing the Evening Post and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Your Graces," she said with a curtsy. "Forgive the interruption, but there's a letter from Her Majesty's private secretary. It appears to be quite official." Margaret and Sebastian exchanged glances, both wondering what could possibly have prompted correspondence from the royal household. Sebastian accepted the letter with some trepidation, breaking the elaborate seal and scanning the contents with growing amazement. "What is it?" Margaret asked, noting the expression of stunned disbelief that had crossed her husband's features. "An invitation," Sebastian said slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was reading, "to a private audience with Queen Charlotte. It seems Her Majesty has heard about the foundation and wishes to discuss the possibility of royal patronage." Margaret felt her knees go weak at the implications of such recognition. Royal patronage would not only provide the foundation with unprecedented resources, but would also lend it a legitimacy and social acceptance that would open doors throughout the kingdom. "Royal patronage," she repeated faintly. "The Queen wants to support our work." According to this letter, Her Majesty has been following the Foundation's progress with great interest. She's particularly impressed by our success in helping young women escape forced marriages and establish independent lives. She wishes to meet with us personally to discuss how the Crown might support and expand our efforts. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this recognition could mean for their mission. "Sebastian, do you realize what this could accomplish? With royal support, we could establish refugees in every major city, provide education and training programs, create a network of protection that would span the entire kingdom." "I realize it," Sebastian said, his voice full of pride and wonder as he looked at his wife. "And I realize that it's all because of you, because of your courage in speaking out about your experiences, and your determination to help others avoid the same fate." "It's because of us," Margaret corrected firmly. "Because you were willing to risk social censure to marry a woman of uncertain background, because you provided the resources and connections necessary to make the foundation a reality, because you've stood beside me through every challenge and setback." As they sat together in their private sitting room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of their happiness and success, both Margaret and Sebastian marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a chance encounter on a lonely Yorkshire road had grown into something far greater than either had imagined possible. A love story that had inspired others, a charitable mission that was changing lives throughout England, and a partnership that had proven the transformative power of compassion and courage. "There's something else," Sebastian said, reaching for another letter that had been included in the evening's correspondence. "From the Archbishop of Canterbury. It seems our story has reached even the highest levels of the Church." Margaret looked at him with curiosity and some apprehension. "What does the Archbishop want with us?" "He's writing to commend our charitable work and to request that I consider accepting appointment as a special advisor on matters relating to marriage law reform. Apparently, our foundation's documentation of forced marriage cases has provided valuable evidence for those seeking to strengthen legal protections for vulnerable women." "Marriage law reform," Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "That could prevent so many of the situations we've been trying to address after the fact." "Exactly. Instead of simply helping women escape bad situations, we could work to prevent those situations from arising in the first place. It would be a natural extension of the Foundation's mission. As the evening shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret and Sebastian continued to discuss the extraordinary opportunities that were opening before them. The foundation that had begun as Margaret's way of transforming her painful experience into something positive had grown into a movement that was attracting attention and support from the highest levels of society. "Do you ever feel overwhelmed by it all?" Margaret asked as they prepared for bed, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child continued to grow. "The responsibility, the expectations, the knowledge that so many people are depending on our work?" "Sometimes," Sebastian admitted, helping her with the fastenings of her dress, with the gentle care that marked all his attentions to her comfort. "But then I remember why we started this work in the first place, not for recognition or acclaim, but because we knew what it felt like to be lost and desperate, and we wanted to ensure that others wouldn't have to face that alone. And because we learned that love really can conquer all," Margaret added softly, turning in his arms to face him. "Not in the fairy tale sense of making all problems disappear, but in the real sense of giving us the strength and motivation to work together towards something meaningful." "Our love story isn't ending," Sebastian observed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "It's just beginning a new chapter, one where we get to share what we've learned with others, where we get to help write happy endings for people who thought such things were impossible." As they settled into bed together, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment, from isolation to love, from helplessness to purpose. The frightened young woman who had fled her uncle's house in the dead of night could never have imagined that her desperate gamble would lead to such happiness and meaning. "Sebastian," she said softly in the darkness, her voice full of wonder and gratitude. "Yes, my love. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for seeing something worth saving in a lost, desperate stranger. Thank you for showing me that love really can transform everything." "Thank you," Sebastian replied, his arms tightening around her, "for staying, for trusting me enough to let me help you, for showing me that it was possible to love again, to hope again, to build something beautiful from the ruins of the past." Outside their window, the Yorkshire moors stretched away into the darkness, wild and beautiful and eternal. Somewhere out there, other young women might be facing the same desperate choices that had once confronted Margaret. But now, thanks to the foundation they had built together, those women would have options, would have hope, would know that they were not alone. The most beautiful love story between a wealthy widowed duke and the young woman he found lost had become something even more precious, a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, and to inspire others to believe in the possibility of their own happy endings. And in the quiet sanctuary of their shared bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of their love and the promise of their growing family, Margaret and Sebastian knew that their story was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. This tale reminds us that love often finds us when we least expect it, and that our greatest trials can become the foundation for our most meaningful triumphs. Margaret and Sebastian's story shows us that true nobility lies not in birth or wealth, but in character and compassion. Their journey from a chance rescue to lasting love, and from personal happiness to public service, proves that the most beautiful love stories are those that inspire others to believe in the possibility of transformation, redemption, and hope. In a world where women had few choices and even fewer protections, their foundation became a beacon of hope for those who found themselves in impossible situations. Their love story became a legend, not just because of its romantic elements, but because of its demonstration that love, when combined with purpose and action, can change the world one life at a time.